Hello and welcome to this week's of Photographic Life, and I'm going to start this week with a listener's letter. It says this: Hi Grant, I find so much that's thought-provoking in a photographic life. Thank you for that. I often find myself mentally composing responses, but somehow this is one that I find myself actually writing. I agree with much of what you said in your recent post about photography. Much of what you said points to the reasons that I prefer the term artist to photographer in my own self-description, although I see both as being accurate for me. I'm not saying that photographer isn't a more appropriate description for many people, but I don't think it is for me. I agree that there's a valid distinction between artist and photographer, although I think I see that distinction somewhat differently from the way you do. In my opinion, there's overlap, kind of like a Venn diagram. It seems to me that some, but not all, artists are photographers, and some, but not all, photographers are artists. Since I'm not as brave as you, I hesitate to offer a definition of art, but it seems to me that creative expression is probably somewhere near its core, regardless of what materials and/or equipment are used to reach that goal. I see a photographer as someone who is skilled with a camera, or more broadly, with photographic technique. I think of documentation as being generally more relevant to photographers than to artists. Here's an example that might help clarify. For myself, if I make a photograph of a tree in a park, I'm not hoping that the photograph will look like that particular tree in that particular park, which might be the intent of someone whose self-description is primarily as a photographer. For example, to illustrate a historical text or a promotional brochure about the park. I'm hoping that it will work as a metaphor, for example, perhaps of renewal. If I photograph it in the spring, or of complexity, if I photograph it in a way that emphasizes intricate patterns of the branches, or even of something that I haven't yet thought of in a conscious verbal way, at the moment of making the exposure. Or perhaps that it will evoke an emotion that I experience in the tree's presence, all of which, by the way, would also be the case if I had the skill and inclination to paint or draw the tree. It seems to me that some parts of your reasoning rest on conflated levels of analysis. Sorry about the academic language. I'm not an academically trained artist by any stretch of the imagination, but I do have another academic background. You wrote, you, the artist, don't have to only use one medium, clay, watercolour, oils, etc., etc. I agree. And it seems to me that photographic materials and equipment belong on that list. That is, when someone says artist, they could mean a person who works in one or more of any of these media. I often hear the word artist used to refer to musicians. In my mind, at least, oil painters, watercolourists, ceramicists, sculptors, collagists, musicians, dancers and others, including many photographers, are subsets of artists. Artists can literally use anything to express their thoughts, emotions, observations. The photographer cannot. I agree, but by the same token, watercolourists can use only watercolours, ceramicists can use only clay, and musicians can only use sound. The artist does what they want, but the photographer does what they are told for money. What then would you call a person who in photographing does what they want, and maybe earns a little money, or in rare cases enough to live on, or even a lot, or maybe not? One thing I think we can all agree with is that to make photographs you need a camera. No offence, but I actually don't agree. Photography is writing with light. Photo equals light, graph equals writing. And cameraless photography definitely exists. Think of Anna Atkins' photographs of British algae, created at the dawn of modern photography. In all modesty, I've given you a couple of examples of my own work. Like you, I'm not a big fan of labels, but I'm no longer afraid to use the A word in reference to myself. I think it actually fits. Thank you again for all that you do for our field. I look forward to many more intriguing podcast episodes and newsletter posts. J.M. Golding. Well, J.M., I don't agree with you. But that's great that you don't agree with me, and also that you gave such a well-considered response to the article that appeared at unitednationsofphotography.com. A photographic life isn't about agreeing, it's about discussing. Whilst we're talking about the world of photography and art, I was sorting through some books the other day and I came across those of Robert Adams, the American photographer. Two books in particular were Why People Photograph and Beauty in Photography. I really enjoy his books. They're very small, succinct, easy to read, and I think they raise some really good points. The interesting thing for me about Adams is I hadn't heard of him at all until I came into academia and sort of tripped upon his work at some point, which is very poor on my part, as obviously he's one of the great American photographers still living and creating work. I think I first came upon him in the film. In fact, I think I did. The film around Gerhard Stiedel about how he makes the photo books and so forth. And he goes around a series of photographers talking about the books they're working on. Joel Sternfield, Martin Parr, Robert Frank, and, as I say, Robert Adams. What I thought was interesting about Adams was that his work was very much the man himself. Stiedel goes to Adams' house, which is incredibly ordered and structured and kind of clean cut and kind of a sense of Americana in the most kind of subdued way. Adams himself was quietly spoken, very considered also. And the work he creates seems to me a perfect reflection of that. It doesn't shout at you, it whispers. It doesn't lean out of the picture demanding you. It kind of draws you in. It kind of makes you think, is there something happening there? That sense of story, that sense of slight uneasiness, because everything looks so perfect. Surely nothing is that perfect. Anyway, so I came across those books, I popped them on my bookshelf and kind of decided I think I'll reread those again. So this week's recommendation is, if you're not aware of Robert Adams, then look at his work. And if you find his work interesting, make sure you read his books. I think the problem with Adams' work, if there is a problem, is the fact that it looks so simple. And what that leads to in photography is clichés, photographic clichés. People sort of trying to recreate those images that seem so simple but actually are far more complex than perhaps they appear at first. We all know those clichés, don't we? The pictures that come out of camera clubs of jetties going into a lake, or what I call misty water photographed at a slow exposure. We know those kinds of pictures. Unfortunately, street photography is home to many clichés of I suppose that idea of the brightly coloured person or the eccentric on the street. Still life photography, exactly the same. Portrait photography, it seems to be the home of the cliché. So often I see portrait photography where there is no connection being made between the photographer and the subject. I hate that word subject. That person, it should be a bridge, should be a communication. Some of you might disagree with me on this, but I think it's a bit like a child when they first start to draw and they don't know what to draw. I was really lucky when I was sort of pre-high school. I had a fantastic teacher, art teacher called Mr. Vincent. I remember him to this day. And he used to give a sweet to anybody who could make the first mark on a piece of paper. Therefore, we would all rush to our desks, grab whatever crayon, pencil or paint was available and throw it immediately at that blank space, immediately taking control of that environment, not feeling intimidated by that idea to create. I really rated Mr. Vincent at the time, and I rate him even more now that I can really understand what he was doing and why he was doing it. The classic scenario, isn't it, is of the child who wants to draw something and they say to the parent, "What shall I draw?" And they'll do the house with the sun in the corner and the house will have the door in the middle and some windows around it and maybe a tree. And that will be a cliche drawing. It won't be a reality. So perhaps really for photographers, what we need to do is try and avoid those cliches. Of course, the problem is you've got to know what one is first before you avoid it. Ever since I started to teach photography roughly 15 years ago, I say teach within a institution within a university, I started to recognise that it was under threat. The very essence of teaching the medium seemed to me to be stuck in the past. It didn't seem to be embracing what was going on. It was quite comfortable in the past and things were going okay. Students were coming along and those courses had existed for a long time, sometimes decades. And over that period of time, they developed facilities, darkrooms, studios, equipment. The move from analogue to digital had been problematic for many, but they'd done so and that was okay. With the advent of moving image, another challenge had come to the photographer who had trained in the traditional way. Going through the darkroom, learning with analogue, and progressing to digital, perhaps begrudgingly, perhaps not. But moving image meant you had to learn new stuff, editing, software, sound, how to construct that narrative. And therefore, a lot of photographers just thought, well, I just won't press that button that's on my new camera. I'll ignore it. In fact, I wrote about that at some length. I suppose because I don't have a traditional photographic training. I didn't study photography within an institution academically. I studied graphic design, which was much, much broader in its outlook. And because of that, I didn't feel intimidated by these new possibilities, such as moving image, and I embraced them fully. Well, over the last few years, things have been looking darker and darker for the photo school. The reason is because photography and its engagement with people, with young people, primarily because of the smartphone, its democratization, has meant that that thing of being a photographer is perhaps not quite so exciting, not so special as it once was. And therefore, recruitment numbers on courses has dropped. Add to that the cost of studying in the UK and in the US and across Europe, and you can see why more and more people think, well, why do I need to do it? Well, what this has resulted in is redundancies, and there have been mass redundancies at UK universities over the last year or so, and there are going to be more, without any shadow of a doubt, over the coming years. Restructures have been taking place within universities. Courses have been closed and amalgamated. As I say, this isn't new. It's been happening for the last 2 or 3 years, but it seems to be building to a real crescendo. And I saw on Facebook recently something that was very, very sad. I'm going to read it to you. But as well as being sad, I think points to the problem that photography got itself into, which is that the photo school was too reliant on the past to see that the future was coming for them. Anyway, it said this. I taught at the University of the Arts, UArts, in Philadelphia for over 23 years. I served as a professor, curator, gallery director, chairman, program director, and coordinator. I also spackled, sanded, and painted the galleries, and along with colleagues, cleaned the toilets before open house. Very much a team effort. This week, without notice, the university announced it was shuttering its doors after 150 years. In terms of photography, we were an incredibly influential institution, with graduates including Irving Penn, who was taught at the school by Alexei Brodovich, George Krauss, Charles Sheeler, and so many more. Sol Mednick founded the photography program and was one of the founders of SPE, the Society for Photographic Education. We had an incredibly rich photographic history. Well, it's all gone in a week. It's made the cover of the New York Times, and the stated reason is that the university suffered a significant and unanticipated cash crunch. As a private university, there isn't government funding to bail them out. And because they failed to follow procedures required from their accreditation agency, they lost their accreditation last Friday. Two other schools of note in our area, PAFA, the Philadelphia Academy of Fine Arts, think Thomas Eakins, and DCAD, the Delaware College of Art and Design, are now shutting down as well. It's such a dark time, I'm forced to drink cheap American whiskey without ice. Of course, the community is heartbroken, but it's done deal. There is talk of a merger, but I wouldn't bet on it. Anyway, Harris Fogel wrote that and posted it onto Facebook. A really sad tale, and a terrible tale, really, that the spreadsheet guys, the money guys, the administration guys messed up. And the reality and the result of that is that people lose their jobs and all of that history goes down the pan. I've put their website address on the page where this podcast is posted on UnitedNationsOfPhotography.com. And when you go to their website now, it's just 2 words: we're closed. Now, I think the issue here for photography is to rethink itself, to reimagine itself, to reconsider our engagement with the medium. Now, I've been talking about this for the last 10 years or so, and I'm a stuck record. But I've always been really surprised within academia that my voice seems to be one of a few calling out for this. I was derided when I said that we didn't teach any analogue photography on the course in which I lead at Oxford Brookes University. I was derided that I didn't fight for dark rooms or for large studio spaces with expensive lighting equipment. I was derided by the academics who I spoke to about what my intention was, but not by people in the photographic community who are actually working, who actually said to me, well, why would you do it anyway else? And I think that's an issue for photography. It can tend to be conservative, and I mean that with a small c, definitely not with a big C, in nature, and therefore desperate to cling on to the past. I'm a huge fan of the past, of history, of knowing our history, as anyone who listens to this podcast knows or reads any of my writing. However, I'm also looking to the future, always. It would be really sad if over the coming months and years, I keep having to report on the kind of closure I've just announced there and discussed. I don't want that to happen. But I could very easily fill up the next 10 or 15 minutes just telling you the names of the institutions in the UK who've already lost staff over the last year. We don't want that to happen. So the challenge for us as photographers, as educators, and let's not forget, we can learn through YouTube. Of course we can. We can learn through online forums. But none of that is the same as the educational sharing that can occur on a formalised course. So I think we need to protect them, and I think we need to support them. I'm certainly going to do my best to do that, and I'd ask you to do the same also, especially if you remember fondly your days of training, or alternatively, if you remember them as a bit of a waste of time because they didn't give you what you needed. I think what we're talking about now is making sure that the courses that do exist respond to where we are now. And of course, what I'm going to suggest we all do is to take care.